Before we start exciting stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share it with your friends. Also, please, can you tell me where and what time you are watching the Midnight Horror? The snow fell relentlessly, cloaking the world in a layer of thick, glimmering white. The New Year's Eve celebration had long since ended in the small town of Ashford, and now, as midnight passed, the streets lay empty, deserted beneath the ghostly light of a half-hidden moon. The crackling of fireworks had faded into the distance, and the joyous laughter of the crowd had dissolved into the deep silence of winter. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something inevitable, yet unknown. Clara stood alone in the kitchen of her old family home, the smell of pine and dust heavy in the air. She stared at the half-full glass of champagne in her hand, the bubbles rising slowly to the surface, popping with faint, delicate sounds that seemed too soft for the weight of the moment. The new year had come. It had been heralded with fireworks, with the world counting down in unison, and with promises of fresh start. But for Clara, the year felt no different than the one that had just ended. She could still feel the crushing emptiness of the last 12 months, the loss of her mother, the strain of unfinished business, and the stifling presence of the house itself. In the past, her mother had always made a grand celebration of New Year's Eve. She had prided herself on ensuring that Clara's life was filled with joy, with laughter, with the hopes of the future. But that had all ended with her sudden death 3 months ago. The funeral had been a blur, and Clara had barely managed to get through the following weeks. It wasn't until she was left alone in this cold, lonely house that she realized just how hollow everything truly felt. Now, as she stood there in the kitchen holding the glass of champagne and gazing out into the dark night, she wondered what the new year would bring. It seemed absurd, this hope for a fresh start. The house, with all its memories, would never change. She would never change. Her fingers tightened around the glass, and for a moment she thought about throwing it, splashing it across the counter in frustration, but then a movement at the corner of her eye caught her attention. The clock in the hallway. It had stopped. It was a strange thing, the old clock. Her mother had always said it was more than just a timepiece, it was a family heirloom passed down through generation. And every New Year's Eve it had struck midnight precisely, no matter what. Clara had never really believed in the superstitions surrounding it, her mother's old tales about how the clock held the essence of their ancestors, how it was more than just a clock. But standing there now, in the quiet of the night, it felt unsettling to see its hands frozen at exactly midnight, just moments after the word had rung in the new year. She set the glass down and walked cautiously toward the hallway, her slippers making faint squeaks on the polished wood floor. The house was as cold as ever, its quiet halls stretched out before her like a maze of shadows and memories. The air felt heavier in the dark, as though it was soaked with things that could never be spoken aloud. The clock, an ancient brass and glass fixture, stood on the wall as though nothing was amiss. Yet, the seconds no longer moved. Clara reached up and touched the cold face of the clock. The hands were still unmoving, and despite the chill in the air, a faint warmth spread over her skin. It was as if the clock was trying to draw her in, to absorb her into its stillness. She pulled her hand back, a strange shiver crawling up her spine. But then something unexpected happened. The hands of the clock moved. Slowly but unmistakably they began to tick, just a fraction at first, and then with more urgency. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she watched, unable to move, her heart pounding in her chest. The clock's ticking grew louder, each tick echoing in the stillness of the house. And then the whisper began. Clara. Her name, spoken softly but urgently, filled the space around her. The voice was faint but distinct, like a breath against her ear. It wasn't her mother's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice she recognized. It was cold, unfamiliar like the rustle of dead leaves in a forgotten graveyard. Clara, come to me. She turned toward the stairs, the voice now a tug in her mind, pulling her toward the upper floors. The house felt alive in a way it never had before, as if the walls themselves were watching her, listening to her every move. A faint cry rose from upstairs, and Clara froze. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a shout. It was a child's laugh. She had never heard it before, but somehow it felt as though it was calling her. Her legs moved without her permission. Her feet carried her up the stairs, each step groaning under her weight. Her hand, trembling, gripped the banister, the dark wood smooth and slick beneath her fingers. The hallway at the top of the stairs was shrouded in shadows, and the air felt thicker, heavier, as though something was pressing down on her chest. She reached her mother's old bedroom, the room she had left exactly as it was after the funeral. The bed still had the old quilts, the nightstand still held the framed pictures of their family. But something was off. The room felt different. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange rhythmic energy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Clara. The whispering came again, louder now, insistent. The voice was in her head, it was in her blood, it was inside her, pulling her deeper into the house. She stepped closer to the bed, her heart hammering in her chest, her skin cold with dread. She could hear it now, the soft sound of something dragging across the floor. Something was moving in the room. It was under the bed. Her breath caught, and without thinking, Clara dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached out toward the edge of the bed. Her fingers brushed against something smooth, something cold, the edges of a box. She pulled it out, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. It was an old, wooden box, decorated with strange symbols she had never seen before. The box was heavy, and as she lifted it, she felt an unnatural coldness seep into her skin. The box seemed to hum in her hands, vibrating slightly as though it were alive. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. Open it. Clara hesitated, her mind screaming at her to stop. But something inside her, something dark and ancient, urged her forward. She set the box down on the floor and opened it. Inside was an old weathered piece of parchment yellowed with age and inscribed with more symbols, more marks that seemed to move as she looked at them. And beneath the parchment, the thing that had been calling to her. A small silver pendant lay at the bottom of the box. Its shape was twisted, contorted, not quite human. It seemed to pulse with a faint light, and Clara could feel her pulse quicken, her breath becoming shallow as her fingers hovered over it. The moment her skin brushed the pendant, everything went dark. When Clara opened her eyes, she was no longer in her mother's bedroom. She stood in a vast, empty space, the floor beneath her feet a smooth, cold surface that stretched out into an infinite void. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and the only sound was a distant ticking like the ticking of an old clock. Clara. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, deafening in its intensity, crashing through her mind like a wave. The clock, she could see it now, an enormous, ancient thing suspended in the air. Its hands spun wildly, faster and faster, and Clara could hear the cries of those who had come before her, her mother, and so many others, each of them trapped in the endless cycle of the clock's ticking. Welcome to your new year, Clara. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness closed in on her, and the ticking grew louder, faster until it consumed her. Back in the house, the clock struck 12 once more. The new year had begun. The curse of the forgotten tomb. The sun had set over the Egyptian desert, casting an eerie orange glow over the endless sand. Somewhere beneath this vast, desolate expanse, a secret lay waiting to be uncovered. A tomb, untouched by time, holding dark memories and ancient curses hidden away for centuries until now. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan has spent her entire career searching for the lost tomb of Pharaoh Akhenaten. As the head of an international archaeological team, her reputation had been built on discoveries that changed the course of history. but nothing could have prepared her for the moment she stood before the entrance of the tomb, her heart racing with excitement and trepidation. "Elizabeth," said Dr. Ian Hawke, her colleague, his voice tense, "this place, I don't know. It feels wrong." Elizabeth glanced at Ian, his pale face etched with worry. He was always the skeptic, the one who dismissed local legends and myths. But even he couldn't ignore the sense of dread that clung to the air like a fog. They had spent weeks uncovering this tomb, following clues that led them to this very spot. The walls were adorned with ancient hieroglyphs, intricate carvings that spoke of an age-old curse. "It's just superstition, Ian," Elizabeth said, trying to reassure herself as much as him. "We're here to make history. This is the find of a lifetime." The tomb, sealed for thousands of years, awaited its first visitors. The ancient entrance was crumbling, but still intact, etched with warnings in a language long forgotten. She felt a chill run down her spine as they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, stale and heavy, and the smell of decay hung in the air. A narrow passageway led deeper into the earth, and the walls seemed to close in on them as they descended. "Stay alert," Elizabeth ordered as the team moved forward with their torches lighting the path. This could be dangerous. The deeper they went, the more the tomb seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The torches flickered as though fighting against an invisible force, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. At last they reached the burial chamber. The moment they stepped inside, a strange sensation washed over Elizabeth, an unshakable feeling that something was wrong. The tomb was magnificent, far more ornate than they had imagined. Carvings of pharaohs and gods adorned the walls, and treasures lay scattered across the floor, untouched by time. But it wasn't the treasures that caught Elizabeth's eye, it was the amulet. It lay half buried beneath a pile of gold, its dark stone gleaming with an otherworldly light. Its shape was unfamiliar, unlike anything she had ever seen. She knelt down and carefully picked it up, feeling a strange energy pulse through her fingertips. "Ian, come here," she said, her voice filled with awe. Ian's eyes widened as he approached. "What is that? It doesn't look like anything from this era." Elizabeth felt the weight of the amulet in her hand, a weight that was both physical and spiritual. It hummed with power, ancient power. "I don't know, but it's important." Before she could say more, a low, guttural rumble echoed from the depths of the tomb. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the walls seemed to groan as though awakening from a long slumber. A chill ran through the room, and the torches flickered violently. The shadows on the walls twisted unnaturally, and the temperature dropped. Then, a voice soft, ethereal, and filled with sorrow whispered through the tomb. "Leave or perish." Elizabeth froze, the amulet still clenched in her hand. Her breath caught in her throat. "Did you hear that?" Ian nodded, his face pale. "Is the ghost the spirit of the princess? The one they say cursed this tomb?" The voice grew louder, more insistent, as though it were coming from the walls themselves. "Leave or face my wrath." The walls seemed to close in on them, and the temperature dropped further, plunging the room into an icy grip. Elizabeth felt a wave of panic wash over her, but she refused to let it overtake her. She had come too far to turn back now. The ghost of the princess, if it existed, was only a tale, nothing more than a superstition. They had uncovered something real, something that would change everything. "Ian, we have to keep going," Elizabeth said, determination in her voice. But as she turned to move deeper into the tomb, something stopped her, something unnatural. A presence, dark and malevolent, filled the chamber. The air thickened and Elizabeth's pulse quickened. She was not alone. A figure, pale and transparent, drifted toward them, her form ethereal, her eyes hollow with endless sorrow. The ghost of the princess, the one who had been cursed to linger in the tomb for eternity, hovered before them, her mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. "You have awakened the curse," the ghost hissed. "Now you must pay." The temperature plummeted as the ghost extended a spectral hand toward them. A wave of dread overwhelmed Elizabeth as the ghost's touch froze her in place, paralyzing her with fear. Ian backed away, his face twisted in terror. "We need to leave," he whispered. now. But the ghost was not alone. From the shadows emerged a figure far more terrifying than the apparition, the mummy of Pharaoh Akhenaten, long preserved but still very much alive. Its ancient bandages were tattered, revealing decayed flesh beneath. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural fire, and its mouth twisted into a terrifying snarl. The mummy's hand shot out, grabbing one of the archaeologists, who screamed in agony as his body was crushed in its grip. "Run!" Elizabeth cried, her voice shaking with fear. "We need to get out of here." The team scattered in panic, but the mummy's strength was unmatched. It pursued them with relentless determination, moving faster than should have been possible for a creature so ancient. The ghost followed, her wailing voice filling the tomb as she cursed them all. As they reached the entrance, the walls seemed to close in, trapping them. Elizabeth felt the weight of the amulet in her hand, and she realized it was the key. The amulet had been placed here to bind the mummy and the ghost, to keep them sealed away forever. But now that they had disturbed the tomb, the curse had been unleashed, and only one could survive. Desperation clawed at Elizabeth's chest as she turned toward Ian. "We need to destroy the amulet," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the only way to stop them." Ian hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "But what if it doesn't work? What if we—" Before he could finish, the mummy lunged at them. Elizabeth threw the amulet into the air, and with a resounding crash, it shattered on the stone floor. A deafening roar filled the tomb as the mummy let out a final scream, its body disintegrating into dust. The ghost wailed, her form flickering in and out of existence before vanishing into nothingness. For a moment, silence fell over the tomb. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. The team, though shaken and terrified, was alive barely. But Elizabeth knew the cost. The curse had been broken, but at a price. The tomb, once a place of history and mystery, would remain lost forever. Epilogue. The desert sun rose the next day, casting its light over the ruins of the tomb. The archaeologists who had survived left the site, their lives forever altered by the horrors they had encountered. The amulet, once a symbol of ancient power, was no more. But Elizabeth couldn't forget the lingering feeling, the sensation that, even though the curse had been broken, something had been left behind. A piece of the darkness forever haunting the forgotten tomb, and as she left the desert behind, she knew that the ghosts of the past would never truly be gone. The tomb, the mummy, and the spirit would wait, for there are some curses that never truly end. Voices in the walls. The first time I heard the voice, I dismissed it as the wind. After all, the old Victorian house I had inherited from my late uncle was a relic, a monument to creaking wood, drafty hallways, and questionable structural integrity. It seemed perfectly reasonable that the whispers I thought I heard were just the house settling into its own haunted history. But then I heard it again, and again. "Help me," the voice would whisper, faint and trembling, as though carried by a breeze too weak to shake the curtains. It was always late at night, always when I was alone, and always from within the walls. When Uncle Jonathan passed, he left the house to me, a nephew he barely knew. I'd only met him twice as a child, but my mother spoke of him with a mix of admiration and pity. A brilliant man, she'd said, but terribly lonely. I never questioned why he chose me to inherit the house. I just saw it as an opportunity. I'd been struggling with my career as a freelance illustrator, and moving into the house meant saving on rent. The house itself was massive, looming over the neighborhood like an old guardian. Its faded gray facade and ivy-choked exterior gave it an air of melancholy, but I found it oddly charming. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of narrow hallways, steep staircases, and rooms that seemed to serve no clear purpose. Every surface carried the faint scent of age and abandonment. I moved in during autumn. The first week was uneventful, filled with unpacking, cleaning, and the occasional distraction from the eccentricities of the house. Doors that wouldn't stay shut, floorboards that groaned like restless spirits, windows that rattled even when the air outside was still. These quirks seemed harmless enough, a testament to the house's age. Then the whispers began. At first I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of fatigue and loneliness, but the whispers grew more distinct. Sometimes they were little more than faint murmurs, like someone talking in their sleep. Other times they were urgent, pleading, "Please don't leave me here." The first time I tried to follow the voice, it led me to a section of the house I hadn't explored yet, a narrow hallway on the second floor. At the end of it was a door with peeling paint and a rusted handle. It was locked. I pressed my ear to the wood, holding my breath, but the voice fell silent. Curiosity gnawed at me. I searched the house for a key, scouring drawers, cupboards, and closets. Hours passed, but I found nothing. Frustrated, I went to bed that night, only to be woken again by the whispering. It was louder now, insistent. "Find me." The following day I called a locksmith. He arrived promptly, a wiry man with a no-nonsense demeanor. As he worked on the lock, I explained the house's peculiarities, omitting the voices. He chuckled. "Old houses like this," he said, "are full of secrets. You'd be surprised what people find in the walls." His words lingered with me as the lock clicked open. The door swung inward, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was empty, save for a single piece of furniture, an antique wooden chair positioned in the center of the room. The walls were bare, except for faint scratch marks near the baseboards. I stepped inside, a chill running down my spine. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the room itself resented my presence. I knelt to examine the scratch marks. They were deep, erratic, as if someone had clawed at the walls in desperation. "Looks like you've got rats," the locksmith said, peering over my shoulder. His voice broke the spell, and I nodded absently. After he left, I sat in the chair, staring at the walls. The whispers didn't return that night, but I felt their absence like a phantom itch. The silence was more unsettling than the voices had been. The next few days passed in a haze of unease. I tried to focus on my work, but the house's atmosphere had shifted. Shadows seemed darker, longer. Every creak and groan of the floorboards felt deliberate, as if the house were alive and watching me. One evening, as I was sketching in the living room, I heard the voice again. This time it was unmistakable, clear as a bell. "Help me," it said, and I froze. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For a moment there was only silence. Then, softly, "I'm trapped." I spent that night researching the house's history. It had been built in the late 1800s and passed through several owners, most of whom had lived uneventful lives. But one story stood out. In the 1920s, a young girl named Eleanor had disappeared. She was last seen playing in the house, and despite extensive searches, no trace of her was ever found. The room with the chair, was it hers? The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore the possibility. Driven by a mixture of fear and determination, I decided to investigate further. I tapped on the walls, listening for hollow spaces. In the room with the chair, my efforts paid off. The wall to the left of the chair sounded different, hollow. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and began prying away the plaster. Dust filled the air, making me cough, but I pressed on. When I finally broke through, I found a narrow cavity just wide enough for someone to squeeze into. Inside, I found a bundle of old, tattered clothing and a small, tarnished locket. The sight of it made my stomach churn. I opened the locket with trembling hands. Inside was a tiny photograph of a girl with wide eyes and a somber expression. "Eleanor," I whispered. That night the voices became more frequent, more desperate. They didn't come from one place anymore. They surrounded me, echoing through the house like a chorus of sorrow. "Help us. Set us free." I couldn't sleep. My dreams were filled with images of Eleanor, her face pale and her eyes filled with terror. In one dream, she stood at the foot of my bed, pointing toward the room with the chair. When I woke, I knew what I had to do. I returned to the room, the crowbar in hand, and began tearing away more of the walls. As I worked, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They guided me, leading me to a hidden compartment in the floorboards. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting cramped and hurried. It belonged to Eleanor. The journal revealed a horrifying story. Eleanor had been locked in the room by her father, a man consumed by paranoia and rage. He believed she was cursed, that her presence would bring ruin to their family. She'd scratched at the walls, screamed for help, but no one came. Eventually, she succumbed to starvation and despair. Her final entry read, "If anyone finds this, please remember me. Don't let me be forgotten." I wept as I read her words, my heart breaking for the girl who had died alone and terrified. That night, I lit a candle in the room and placed the locket and journal on the chair. I spoke aloud, my voice shaking but resolute. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. You didn't deserve this. I'll make sure you're remembered." The house seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. In the days that followed, I contacted local historians and shared Eleanor's story. A small memorial was erected in her honor, ensuring she would never be forgotten. As for the house, it no longer felt haunted. The shadows were just shadows, the creaks just the groans of an old building. But sometimes late at night, I'd hear a faint whisper, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Thank you. 1 year later, as I prepared to leave the house for good, I felt an inexplicable pull to the room with the chair. The memorial had brought closure, but something lingered just beneath the surface of my mind. I walked in and stood before the chair one last time. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. This time they were different. Not alone, others. A chill gripped me. I turned, scanning the walls, and suddenly felt the weight of countless unseen eyes. The house wasn't just Eleanor's prison, it held more. Others who had suffered, others who waited. A sense of duty settled over me. I couldn't abandon them now. The crowbar was still in the corner of the room, coated in dust. I picked it up, heart pounding. "I'll find you," I said aloud, and the whisper surged, a cacophony of hope and despair. The work was far from over, but for the first time I felt ready. Not to escape the house, but to face its secrets head on. The house would remember. And so would I.